Hello students, welcome to BBA 432, International Business Management. Today we're covering Chapter 6, which is going to be about international trade and factor mobility theories. So basically in this chapter we will be looking at the theories of trade. That explain different growth or development patterns, okay? So we will be looking at why policymakers rely on international trade and factor mobility theories to help achieve economic objectives such as growth, development, and so forth and so on. So we will start by first examining theories that endorse great governmental intervention in trade movements, starting with mercantilism and neo-mercantilism. Versus we will be looking at a laissez-faire approach of no governmental intervention, such as the free trade theories of absolute advantage and comparative advantage. We will then look at theories to explain different trade patterns, such as how much countries depend on trade, in what products, and with whom they trade. So therefore, under that topic, we will be looking at the theories of country size, factor proportions, and country similarity theory. And in the subsequent parts of the chapter, we will consider theories that deal with the dynamics of different countries' trade competitiveness for particular products, okay? So then under that topic, we will be looking at the product life cycle theory and the diamond of national competitive advantage theory of Michael Porter. Then the chapter will conclude with an overview of factor mobility, mainly emphasizing the mobility of human resources. Okay, so let's start with the first objective, which is the objective of understanding what is factor mobility, and then we will be looking at different trade theories. Okay, so we need to understand why policymakers rely on international trade and the factor mobility theories. So when I talk about the factor mobility, we are considering a number of concepts under that topic, okay? So basically, factor mobility is the movement of capital, technology, and people. It is the movement of, in other words, organizational and human resources across the borders, right? So it is the movement of capital, technology, and people, okay? Then by understanding the trade theory, this will help managers to focus on the following questions. What products should we import and export? How much should we trade? And with whom should we trade? Okay, those are the three things that the managers focus on by studying these international trade theories. This will help the managers focus on these three questions. What products should we import and export? How much should we trade? With whom should we trade? So basically, if you look at the opening case study in our book, which is all about the evolution of Taiwan's international trade, right? So I highly encourage you guys to look at the opening case study in chapter 6, which is also the map 6.1, right? So it all talks about how Taiwan relied on different trade theories to promote economic growth and development. And it really shows how the country has successfully taken advantage of its location and also used international trade to become one of the Asian tigers, so to speak, right? And the world's 21 largest exporter. Okay, so you will see after reading this case study how Taiwan transformed its economy to the one that emphasizes economic liberalization, industrial products, and export expansion. So the most notable developments in the past 2 decades were the renewal and growth of Taiwan's trade and investment with China, the upsurge of Taiwan's outward FDI, meaning that Taiwanese companies are investing in different parts of the world, right? So that you would see an upsurge of Taiwan's outward FDI, and also growing reliance on foreign contract workers. So all of these factors really boosted the economic growth and the development of the nation. Okay, so let's continue with the second learning objective, which is to illustrate the historical and the current rationale for government interventionism and also the free trade theory. So we're going to start with the interventionist and the free trade theories, okay? Okay, interventionist and free trade theories. So starting with the interventionist theories first, right, which endorse great governmental intervention in trade movements. So those two types of interventionist theories are mercantilism, right, and the neo-mercantilism. Okay, so then we're going to compare and contrast those theories with the free trade theories that endorse a laissez-faire approach of no governmental intervention. Okay, so interventionist theories endorse great governmental intervention in trade, versus we will be looking at the free trade theories that endorse a laissez-faire approach of no governmental intervention. So we will call them the free trade theories of absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So basically, in the case of mercantilism, if you look at the mercantilistic trade policies, its basic assumption is that a country's wealth is measured by its holdings of treasure, which usually means in the early 15th, 16th centuries, gold. So that treasure is gold. So this theory sort of formed the foundation of economic thought from 1500 to all the way to 1800. It was a dominant paradigm, dominant ideology. So basically, this key assumption is that countries should export more than they import, and therefore run a trade surplus. And if successful, receive gold from countries that run deficits. Okay? Right? Should export, the countries should export more than they import, and if successful, receive gold from countries that run deficit. Again, this was the key paradigm during the colonialism period, when these different colonial powers, colonized different parts of the world and extracted gold from the new world. And they were using mercantilistic policies, not only by extracting gold and their resources, but also exporting more than they were importing, and therefore running a trade surplus. Government policies to enact mercantilism is all about running a trade surplus. So how does the government do that? Government restricts the imports and subsidize non-competitive production. So there is the issue of a balance of trade, right? So you look at the balance of trade because the government needs to run a positive balance of trade, right? So a favorable balance of trade, meaning a trade surplus, still indicates that a country is exporting more than it imports. In the case of unfavorable trade balance, which is also known as a trade deficit indicates the opposite. So these terms are most of the time misnomers because the word favorable implies benefit and the word unfavorable suggests impairment. In fact, running a trade surplus is not always necessarily beneficial, nor is running a trade deficit is necessarily detrimental. So you have to always put these issues within its own historical and particular context. Neo-mercantilism is sort of like the extension of the mercantilistic trade theory, right? It's all about, again, running a favorable trade balance to achieve social objectives. So we're taking one step further in the neo-mercantilism, right? So to channel the surplus generated from a favorable trade balance, to channel that surplus into policies that aim to reduce unemployment by encouraging the companies to produce in excess of the home demand and send the surplus abroad, right? So a country, in other words, can reduce unemployment by using neo-mercantilistic economic policies by encouraging its companies to produce in excess of the home demand, right? And send the surplus abroad as exports. Or the government also may attempt to maintain political influence in an area by sending more merchandise there than it receives, such as government granting merchandise, aid, or loans to a foreign government. So there are different ways of encouraging different countries to receive exports from that neo-mercantilistic government. Okay? So learning objective 2 is the opposite of the learning objective 1 because we're trying to understand the rationale, the historical and the current rationale for the interventionist and the free trade theories, right? So why do countries trade at all? Okay, to begin with, no nation has all the natural resources, geographic conditions, and the technology necessary to produce everything we consume today, right? So in 1776, Adam Smith, the British economist, argued that a country's well-being is its citizens' access to goods and services rather than the mercantilistic concept of its ownership of gold. So Adam Smith was a huge critic of mercantilism. So he was a liberal economist, right? He was a liberal economist, also a critique of government intervention in the economy. The British economy at the time was hugely relying on mercantilistic economic policies by putting all sorts of restrictions on the imports and encouraging exports. So Adam Smith introduced the notion of absolute advantage, which holds that different countries produce different things more efficiently than others, and that consumers should not have to buy domestically produced goods when they can buy them more cheaply from abroad. Okay, so the notion of absolute advantage, in other words, is the understanding that different countries produce different things more efficiently than others. For instance, Mexico produces tequila more efficiently than other countries, right? So, on the other hand, a natural advantage in production comes from the climatic conditions, access to natural resources, and availability of certain labor forces. Most of today's world trade is in manufactured goods that compete through an acquired advantage as opposed to natural advantage, usually in either product or process technology. So, for instance, as I gave you guys the example of tequila in Mexico, right? It is Mexico's natural advantage to produce tequila most efficiently, because of the climatic conditions over there, access to certain natural resources, or availability of certain labor forces. Like, think about coffee. Coffee is produced only in certain climatic conditions. Wine is produced only in certain climatic conditions, right? California wine producers or French wine producers enjoy the natural advantage because of their unique location and geography. However, comparative advantage is indeed different, because comparative advantage says that global efficiency gains result from trade if a country specializes in what it can produce most efficiently, right? Regardless of other countries' absolute advantage, okay, or natural advantage. So comparative advantage is something that can be gained, right, if a country specializes in what it can produce most efficiently. Who introduced the theory of comparative advantage? It was indeed David Ricardo. David Ricardo introduced the theory of comparative advantage. He reasoned that there would still be gains from trade if a country specialized in the production of those things that it can produce more efficiently than other countries. Even if other countries can produce the same things even more efficiently, right? So the argument here is that in Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, right, a country can maximize its own economic well-being by specializing in the production of those goods and services that it can produce relatively efficiently and enhance global efficiency through its participation in free trade. Okay? Right? Mexico's comparative advantage is the production of goods by using the cheap labor, because the labor is much more efficient and cheaper in Mexico. So it is in Mexico's comparative advantage to produce T-shirts with the efficiency that it has, and that efficiency is related to cheap labor, whereas cheap labor does not exist in the United States. Labor in the United States is not as cheap. Since the labor is much cheaper in Mexico, it's in Mexico's comparative advantage to produce T-shirts and export to the United States. So here, there are some assumptions made about absolute and comparative advantage, that those assumptions are important, okay? So we're assuming in the comparative advantage and absolute advantage theory fully employed resources. So it's assuming that the resources are fully employed, meaning land, labor, and capital. Okay? So it's assuming economic efficiency, assumes the goal is the maximum income. The third assumption is the division of gains, right? May forego trading if to prevent others from gaining an advantage. There's another assumption about the transportation costs, right? If it costs more to transport than the savings, the theories don't work, right? Because the transportation will be a cost factor which will diminish the efficiency of production, okay? And then insufficient demand. Even with insufficient demand, there is still an advantage. Then the other assumption is about the statistics and dynamics. These theories always look at one point in time. And also the other assumption is all about the services, right? The theories deal with products rather than services. So if we look at the comparative advantage by analogy, there is another, let's try to give an example to comparative advantage by analogy. Think about this example, for instance. Would it make sense for the best physician in town, who also happens to be the most talented medical secretary, to handle all of the administrative duties of an office? Right? No. The physician can maximize both output and income by working as a physician and rather employing a less skilled secretary, right, to do the administrative duties. It will make much more sense, right, in terms of both output, time, and income and efficiency, to hire a less skilled secretary to do all the administrative duties. So, in the same manner, a country will gain if it concentrates its resources on the production of goods and services that it can produce most efficiently, as I gave you guys the example of garment production in Mexico, right? Mexico can exploit this advantage because of the availability of less skilled and cheaper labor force, okay? Here is the learning objective 2, which is all about illustrating the historical and the current rationale for interventions and free trade theories. And this map shows the comparison between United States economies and similar sized country economies. Okay? So, starting now with another theory which explains different national trade patterns, right? Focusing on the question of how much does a country trade? Right? So we're shifting our focus from efficient production to theories that explain trade patterns. Okay? So the first one is how much does a country trade? So we will be looking at two theories, the theory of the country size and size of the economy. So you see different trade theories answer different questions. There is no single trade theory that is perfect and can answer these different sorts of questions. So each trade theory highlights only one aspect of trade patterns, okay? So the theory of the country size answers the question of how much does a country trade, right? The country size theory holds that countries with larger land masses usually depends on trade than smaller ones, okay? Countries with larger land masses usually depend less on trade than smaller ones. So which is true. Smaller countries are those who are more frequently engaged in international trade and which are also more dependent on international trade. So they are apt to have, these type of countries are apt to have more varied climates and an assortment of natural resources that make them more self-sufficient. Right? Think about the US economy, which is a large economy, but think about a country like in the Caribbean. Their source of income is mainly derived from international trade, exporting goods, exporting natural resources like coffee, sugar, rum, and making a living from international trade. Indeed, those countries are dependent on international trade more than a large economy like the United States. So the second one is the size of the economy argument, the size of the economy. While the land area helps explain the relative dependence on the trade, countries' economic size helps explain absolute differences in the amount of trade. Okay? So here, the size of the economy, in other words, is a response to the limitations of the country size. It's not only the country size, the land area, but it is also the country's economic size, like the GDP, right? Which explains absolute differences in the amount of trade. The world, for instance, think about this example. The world's largest 5 economies in 2014 were also the top 5 exporting countries. So that the size is measured by the GDP of that country, right? So those largest 5 economies in terms of GDP, they were also the top 5 exporting economies. Okay? So the second question here, we're dealing with what types of products should a country trade? Okay? What types of products should a country trade? So we will be looking at the factor proportions theory, right? So according to the factor proportions theory, countries have their best trade advantage when depending on their relatively abundant production factors. So we're looking at the abundancy of resources. Let's say if a country is relatively abundant in cheap labor, then they should use cheap labor. They should substitute cheap labor with capital. If they have an abundance of capital resources, then they should rather depend on those capital resources to produce goods and export them. So it's all about the relative abundancy of each factor. If a country is abundant in cheap labor, then it should rather use cheap labor. If a country is abundant in cheap sources of capital, then it should use capital to produce goods. Okay? Then we look at the other question of with whom do countries trade? With whom do countries trade? Which is another question. And the country similarity theory tries to answer this question, right? Which says that the companies create new products in response to market conditions in their home market, right? Companies create new products in response to market conditions in their home market. So then they turn to markets they see as most similar to what they are accustomed, right? Especially those markets where consumers have comparable levels of per capita income. So countries, in order to do trade and export their goods, countries export their goods to countries that they are more familiar with, right? That they are more accustomed, especially those countries where there are comparable levels of per capita income. So according to this assumption, for instance, the US culture is somewhat similar to, or consumption patterns are somewhat similar to UK, or vice versa. The United States would tend to export UK or other Western European countries, right, with comparable levels of per capita income. Okay? And for the time being, let's stop here, because in the next slide, actually in this slide, I will be talking about the product life cycle theory. Because we will be using this theory to explain why a country's export capabilities and economic growth are a dynamic process. Okay? So thanks for listening to my lecture so far. And in the second part of my lecture, in other words, in part 2, I will be talking about the product life cycle theory, and we will continue to talk about other theories of comparative advantage. Thanks for listening to my lecture, and see you shortly. Have a good day. Bye-bye.